How is everyone doing? This is a Q&A. I'm bringing these things back. I've been doing Q&As for the last while, and I decided that it's time to bring them back. Looking forward to getting any questions you guys have got on financing and stuff like that. Now, I have a free community that you can join, school community, and I've taken a lot of the questions from inside of there. But today, we're going to be talking about financing, mortgages, real estate, property deals, all that kind of stuff. So, you guys, if you've got any questions, put them in there. But I'm going to go through a number of questions that I already have created. And what I'm going to suggest, if you guys are interested in real estate, all that kind of stuff, the best place to go and drop your questions is in my YouTube channel. I've got YouTube open here. I know some of you are coming in on Instagram and some of you coming in on TikTok. But the good thing about the questions, I sometimes with these live streams, there are so many questions that come in so quickly that it's nearly impossible to keep up with the questions coming in. So what I'm going to suggest is, if you guys don't mind, if you have any questions, go into YouTube, go to Gavin J. Gallagher, and you'll see the live stream is on there, and you can go and put your chats in. So getting into some questions, and the questions that a lot of people are asking, the first one that I have, and again, these were dropped in the free school community. My school community is called Elite Property Community, and so you'll find it there. But the first question that I'm looking at is, for mixed use property purchases in Ireland, what's typical for a booking deposit? Is it a percentage or a fixed amount? And are there any quirks or timelines when it comes to commercial terms versus residential? Like, there's a lot of questions in there. So this is straight into complication. The first thing I'll say, the difference between a booking deposit and a purchase deposit, if somebody is asking you for a booking deposit, you are not going to have a binding agreement with a booking deposit. What a booking deposit is, it's kind of proof that you are genuinely interested. Lots of people can ring up somebody and say, I'm really interested in the property. Can you hold one for me? And if you say, I'll hold the property for you, you want to see the color of the person's money. And so when it comes to selling a property that is ready to sell today, we'll say, there is no need to do that. Really, where booking deposits come in is when something is under development. Let's say you're building a housing estate, and in the process of building the housing estate, you are, you're delivering the houses in a certain number of phases. So let's say, in the case of a recent development that we did, we built 50 units, and we delivered the first 7 right away at the very beginning. And then you start moving into the development and you start delivering, say, the next block, and then the next block, and the next block. And the great thing about an estate, we'll say, is that you can sell properties in those kind of small units. So 7 units, fully finished, ready to hand over. You can sell it to somebody. And then you go to the next stage. It's very different with an apartment building. With an apartment building, the entire building has to be completed before you can sell any of it. And so houses are easier. You've got an individual hall door. Once you've built the driveway, once it's connected to power and water, you're pretty much ready to kind of sell the thing. And so what we would do as developers, and what a lot of people would do, is they would prefer that as a means of delivery. Your risk is kept down kind of under a certain amount of control. You're not borrowing the maximum amount of money because you're getting money in from purchasers as you go. Now, when you start a development and you're really only beginning, you might sort of put a sign up saying, this development is under construction, it's coming soon. Are you interested in, buying one of these homes? And a lot of the time, people will say, yes, I'm very interested. And they'll be asked to kind of fill out an email, name and email or whatever. And if that's the case, fine. But that's not showing a great deal of commitment. And if you really wanted to show that you are genuinely committed to going ahead with it, you're going to be asked to put down a booking deposit. Now, a booking deposit is really just a show of seriousness that, I'm definitely going to go ahead with this. And look, here's 5,000, here's 10,000, whatever it is. Now, if you're putting down a deposit, let's say you're purchasing a house from somebody, you put down, or let's say you win, you go to an auction. If you buy a property in an auction, at the end of the auction, they go very, very quickly in an auction. You have people saying, do I have 200,000? And you might put your hand up, and then 205, 210, 220, and it goes back and forth very, very rapidly. And at the end of the process, if you're successful, let's say the bidding ends at 300, you're going to have to walk into the back office, and you're going to have to take out a checkbook, and you're going to have to pay 30 grand, 10%. And that is a binding commitment to go ahead with the purchase. It's quite different to a booking deposit. Booking deposit, you could say, here's 10 grand, but it's not binding. If either side decide to change the mind, you get your 10 grand back. But with a binding deposit on a purchase or something like that, you're not getting it back. If you walk away, if you buy something at auction and you walk away, you lose your 30 grand. And that is one of the reasons why some people hate auctions. But something nice about auctions is that you get the finality of a decision right there and then. The first house that I bought was, the second house that I bought was in an auction. And I can remember doing my, sums and working out, okay, how much can I afford to buy, to pay for it? And I can remember it was I think my budget, the maximum figure was 375. And I think, like, it's a long time ago now, but I think at the time it was possibly 300 and, we'll say 350 or 310 or 325 might have been the guide price. So I kind of thought to myself, okay, let's say, goes 20, 25% over. So 375, and I'll agree to pay 375. Anyway, on the day of the auction, go in, your solicitor is asked, to check the title deeds before you start bidding, because the solicitor has to be comfortable that what you're bidding on now, you're going ahead with the purchase, whether or not, there's no getting out of it after. And so my solicitor took a look at the title deed, said, yeah, it looks good. And so at the end of, I'd say it maybe lasted 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. It's, okay, do we have, and what's funny about auctions is it'll start at a higher price. Let's say, do we have 300? Do we have any offers at 300? And they'll go around and there's no offers. And then, do we have 290? No, nobody puts their hand up. Do we have 270? And then I think it was me who said 270. And then it's funny because you kind of think, am I the only one interested in this property? And then suddenly 270. And then somebody puts their hand up, 275. And then somebody puts their hand up, 280, 285, 290. And I was putting my hand up and people were putting up their, and suddenly it's just in a couple of seconds, 320, 330, 340, 350, 360. And I was thinking, okay, 375 is my max. 365, 370, 375, 380, 380. And I'm there, even though it's my max of 375, here I am putting up my pen and going over my own limit, because the emotions of it, you just get caught up in the emotion. And I can remember going to 380, 385. And I remember thinking to myself, whoa, I'm already over my budget and it's still moving up quite quickly. And then it got to 390. And then he says, do I have anyone else? And the guy that was bidding against me said 391. And the moment he said it, I knew, okay, I've got this. And I just went 392. And then it's, do we have anyone else? Do we have anything else? And it was back and forth, back and forth. And then it was sold 392 to this man over here. Get up, go into the room, sit down with your solicitor and take out your checkbook. And I had to write a check for 32,900 or 39,200. Had to write the 10% check right there and then. And then I think it was 6 weeks later or whatever, that's when the you have to come up with the rest of the funds. So big, fast, emotional ride going to an auction. But the question was about booking deposits. Booking deposits quite different. Like, I wouldn't really even consider a booking deposit to be all that serious. You don't have a guarantee. Somebody can take your money and then a couple of weeks later say, here, we're giving you back your money. The sale is is not going ahead, and you've got nothing you can do against it. It's really just kind of a signal that you are serious, that you're actually willing to give money. And I remember seeing when I was when I was in, I bought property abroad overseas one time. I bought it in Spain, and I had to put down 10%. And I can remember putting down the 10%. That was a booking deposit. But a couple of weeks later, I was asked to fly down to Spain and for that to be turned into an actual formal deposit. And then you're into a process where you actually have to come up with the rest of the money. So, are there any quirks or timelines when it comes to commercial terms versus residential? Well, if you're buying a property, it doesn't really change things massively. But when it comes to a lease, it's very, very different. If you're renting a house out to an individual who is going to be living there, well, that's the family. That's basically the person's living quarters, and they're moving in there. You're supposed to register it with the RTB, and the RTB, the Residential Tenancies Board here in Ireland, will say. Once that is registered, then these people, they like the person that's moved in, they have rights, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of landlords are pulling out of the market is because there's the rights are fairly much in the favor of the tenant. And I know I have a mastermind group of clients that we in fact we just spoke a few hours ago. We do a weekly call, and we were talking about the headaches that people have experienced. And somebody rented a property to somebody, and within a couple of months, that person just stopped paying the rent. And then you have to go and try to have them removed. And you have to go through a process in the RTB. And the process is very time consuming. And I think it took somewhere in the region of 18 months for the RTB to actually get the person out of the property. And so you can see why a landlord would be kind of thinking, no thanks, I just don't need that kind of headache. With commercial terms, it's very different. Commercial, first of all, when you're signing a lease with somebody for a home or something, usually you'll sign like a 12-month lease or something like that. Now that person will have certain rights once their stay has gone beyond a certain time frame. But when you sign up, like, say, a commercial lease with somebody, a commercial lease, it could be for 20 years. Like the first commercial lease I was ever involved in was a 35-year lease. And they don't really happen anymore. There are the odd occasional one that you might see. But generally speaking, 35-year leases are not common any longer, but they used to be quite typical. And when they used to, my son is coming to do a DJ. I'm doing a live stream. Look at all these people; they're all looking at you. So go down. So anyway, he wants to stay. Do you want to stay? Yeah.
And on TV.
Okay, it's on the TV downstairs.
And yeah, but the remote's not there.
Ask mommy.
I don't know.
Ask mommy. Mommy knows.
I already asked mommy. But...
Ask her again. Sorry, guys. So she'll know because I don't know. Maybe Erica put it away.
No, she doesn't know. My mommy don't know either.
Off you go. I'm talking here. So anyway,
okay, give your phone.
No, I'm on the phone. I'm using the phone. Sorry, guys. Go on. I have to do this call. These people are all waiting for me. Say to mommy that Daddy's on the call. All right, guys. There's the perils of doing a live stream from home. Right. The next question that I see on my list here is: why do Irish banks treat investment mortgages like you're asking for a kidney? All right. So yes, there are a lot of restrictions around investment mortgages, and I've seen this. A lot of the people. I'm seeing a comment there on YouTube from Thunder Striker, and life is treating me good, so thank you for your message. The situation with if you look at the two types of real estate, like property mortgages, if you're trying to buy a home and it's going to be your principal private residence. You're going to move in there with your wife and your children and stuff like that. You're going to set up a base there. You're going to go and put your kids into the local school there, all of that stuff. So you're very much laying down roots. And so when you take out a mortgage with a bank sees that as a very, very stable loan. They don't see that as somebody that will just stop paying the mortgage because they feel like it. The way that the bank look at that is this person is going to put their home at the very top of their priority list. They're going to say, this person, he's buying a property, his kids are in school, his wife, he's living there with his family and everything. That is a very, very solid investment. That person does not want to risk being thrown out of their house. They don't want the disruption of a legal process to take the house back, all that kind of stuff. So that is one of the reasons why banks will lend you, if you're purchasing a home, they'll lend you up to 90% of the value of the property. You only have to come up with 10% deposit if you're buying it for your home. Now, you have to demonstrate the ability to pay the mortgage. And that's one of the reasons why the central bank have got rules around the multipliers. If you're earning 100,000 a year, if you and your wife combined income is 100,000 a year, they will allow you to borrow something like 4 times that, and they will also you'll be expected to put up a certain the deposit yourself. Now turn around and let's say that this is you already have a home and you want to buy this property that you're looking at, and what your intention is to buy the property and simply rent it out. You're not thinking about buying it for your home. You're thinking about this is an investment. If that's what you do, the bank do not look at that in the same way. They don't think of it as a secure investment because they think to themselves, if the market goes wrong, if the market goes negative, we'll say, first of all, you can have a tenant, as I mentioned earlier, you can have a tenant that just decides, I'm not paying the rent. So you're the landlord, you have a mortgage, but the mortgage that you have is actually um, is dependent on you collecting rent from your tenant. And if your tenant decides to stop paying you, you now have a problem coming up with the money to fund that mortgage. So the banks see that, first of all, as a risk. Whereas if you are earning money, if let's say you and your wife have a combined income and the money is coming in, and somebody and the bank are sort of saying, well, this person has a steady job, they collect so much every month, and their mortgage is, we'll say, a third of the income that they take home. They see that as a relatively safe thing. But if your mortgage is funded by a tenant who's renting the property, then they say to themselves, okay, what are the things that could go wrong? The tenant stops paying the rent. What is the risk to the tenant? Well, the tenant stops paying rent, can move to another location and move into another property. There's nothing at stake for the tenant in the same way as you've paid a deposit and you stand to lose a lot of money if the bank take the property back. But if you were to choose between your family home, where your family live and your children go to the nearby school, if you were to choose between that and an investment property that you own, which one would you let go first? Vast majority of people would say, let the investment property go first. I'm not going to risk us, the kids, everything, like either the kids having to be pulled out of the school, or I'm not going to allow the disruption of our lives of being turfed out of the house, the embarrassment, maybe the neighbors learning that you've lost your home or something like that. Whereas an investment property, they don't really, you can just say, do you know what, just let it go. Tell the bank we'll give them the keys and they can just like take it back or whatever. So banks look upon an investment property as something that you will allow to fall into arrears much easier than your personal home. And because of that, they are much more reluctant to give you the money. Now, they do give you money, but it's not as easy. What they'll first of all insist on is that your deposit that you put down, instead of it being 10%, the likelihood is that you're going to have to put down somewhere between 30 and 40%. And when you put down 30 or 40%, that's a big chunk of change. The reason the bank are doing that is that in the event that the market was to turn negative very quickly, let's say you buy the property at 200 grand and it falls in value to 150 grand. Like, the bank is still in the money because you've put 40% down. If the market was to drop by 25%, they are still okay. If they take that property from you and sell it, they will still fully recover all of their loan. And whereas they're not so concerned about doing the same. I see a comment there. What about shadow banks? Will they lend for rental properties? Yes, although they can be more expensive. So there is various people. Like, I'm actually, if you guys are familiar with my podcast, I have a podcast called Behind the Facade, and that podcast, I go out there and I interview various people, and I brought a lady on about maybe 9 months ago called Margaret Barrett, Mags Barrett. And she is the managing director of Mortgage Navigators. So I brought her on. She answered a lot of questions about all this kind of stuff. So I would certainly suggest you go and check out that podcast episode. But yeah, certainly the shadow banks. There are one in particular, I think, that I can remember her mentioning. I think ICS. ICS, they lend money for investment property, and they do it based on the rental income rather than your taxable income. And so, if you're, when people are buying a home, it's all about how much income do you take home from your job. And most of the banks, they do the same when it comes to you having to borrow the money. But with ICS, my understanding from the last conversation I had with Mags was that they will lend you the money based on the income stream from that property. So if the property is collecting 3 grand a month or whatever, they will base your repayments on that. Now, they usually stress test it a little bit. The stress test is there just in case. Let's say you're renting to 4 different people, 4 different rooms or 4 different floors or something like that. If one of them was to move out, can you still pay the mortgage with the depleted income coming in? And so they will do various stress tests and stuff like that. Does bridging finance exist for property purchases in Ireland, or is private lending the only option? So there is a new product that I understand. I can't remember who. It might be Avant Mortgages or something like that. I can remember when I spoke with Margaret, she mentioned, I think it might have been Avant, but there are various bridging finance options out there, but you have to be careful because they are quite expensive. And one thing you've got to be careful of when it comes to this kind of thing, if you buy a property, let's say you commit to buying a property, and then you say, okay, we have a property, we're sale agreed on a property. Now let's go and sell our property. And so the timings don't necessarily line up. You're in the process of selling your property, but you need to purchase this property, and they don't align. Maybe there is like a month of difference between. And in fact, it's funny, I met somebody today who was exactly in that position. They had sold their property and they were buying another property, and it was all aligned. It was nice and the timing was good. And then suddenly the person that they were buying from, that couple were going through a divorce. And so they said, oh, we're actually delaying the close of the sale until the divorce is finalized. And suddenly these guys, they had sold their property, and now they're there, they don't have a property to move into. So they had to move into rental accommodation. And then you know how hard it is to find rental accommodation in this market. So really messy. The way that they would look at it though is we'll just go and we'll get bridging finance, we'll close the deal, and then as soon as our house closes, we will be able to go and just pay back the bridging finance. Now you can imagine it's about 1% a month. The last time I checked the bridging finance, so it's expensive. It's like 12% a year. And from my understanding, when I was speaking with Mags, the mortgage broker, she was she was saying you got to be very careful, because what happens with people is they agree to buy a place, they get out the bridging loan, they pay it, and then they say, "Oh, we'll be very quickly selling our own property." And then all of a sudden, there's some wrinkle in the deal. Maybe there's like a title deed issue, or maybe somebody is buying, and those people that are buying, it's subject to them selling their house. So they won't have the funds until they sell their house, and maybe there's an issue. And you've gone and you've taken out a loan, and you're paying 1% a month on that loan. And you think at the most I'll be a month or 6 weeks and then we'll pay it back. And suddenly a year later, you're still there. Like that could be over 100,000 in interest payments, if depending on the size of the loan. So you got to be careful with that. Angelo asks, 28, just closed on a house with HTB scheme as a primary residence. I plan to live in the house and rent a room. If you were in my situation, how would you go about buying a second property? Well, it can be difficult if you've just closed on a place, then you've got to stabilize your income. Like the way it works with, if you're going to go and get mortgages and all that kind of stuff, what you need to do is you need to provide 6 months of evidence that you have the ability to fund a mortgage. So let's say you go out there and you buy a property, or you put you go sale agreed on the property. You're going to go to a bank and you're going to say, "Can I have a mortgage, please, for this property?" And what they'll do is they will really go through every line in your bank statement, and they will go back 6 months. So you need to be ready to go. You need to be mortgage ready. That's actually the name that I gave the podcast episode that I did with Mags, is that you arrive with your 6 months of bank statements, and you knew that you would be going to the bank and demonstrating with this bank statements, because they'll be going through, and if they see things like Paddy Power bookmakers, if they see that you like to go to the horse races and you like to put money down on horses and stuff, that's a big red flag. Like that's them saying, "Oh, hold on a second, this person maybe has a gambling habit." Or so you got to be very, very strategic. If you're going to go and take out a mortgage, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have regular income, and the income is coming in, and you have the ability to accumulate sufficient income that you can cover like a second mortgage. So in the case of Angelo here, who's asking this question, you might, like, first of all, you're going to need a deposit on the second property. One of the ways that we would go about doing this is I would buy a property that is a bit of a fixer-upper, and you would buy a property that maybe has the potential to extend. So you build an extension out the rear, you turn it into a property that's generating additional income. What I hear a lot of people doing, and some of my clients are doing this as well, although not so much now because it's becoming a little bit too expensive, but HMO. The HMO is a very popular option. Tall Americana. I have to get back to you. You know why. The guys that are doing HMOs, and a HMO is a house of multiple occupation. One of the reasons that is really popular is because you can get a lot more income from a property when it's a HMO than if it is just rented to a single family. And so let's take, for example, a 4-bedroom house. And if you take your 4-bedroom house, let's say here in Dublin, a 4-bedroom house, like some parts of Dublin's very, very expensive now, but let's say 2.5 grand a month. You can get 2.5 grand a month from this 4-bedroom property. But if you live, we'll say, near a university, you might say, okay, instead of renting it to a family at £2.5 grand a month, let's split the house up into rooms and let's rent the 4 bedrooms upstairs out individually, and we'll get 750 per room per month. That's now £3 grand a month that you're getting instead of 2.5. But in addition to that, you go downstairs and your sitting room, you convert your sitting room into a self-contained apartment. Depending on where the pipes and stuff are, you might even be able to put a bathroom, like an ensuite bathroom in there. So now you have 5 bedrooms. That downstairs one's getting another 750. So now you're at 3750. And then some of the guys that I've worked with would actually go and build out to the rear. So let's say there's a long rear garden. They would do an extension that goes out and builds another 2 bedrooms out into the rear garden. Now you've just added another 1,500. So you can see how suddenly you go from getting 2,500 a month to having a property that's generating 4.5, 5,000 a month. And a number of my coaching clients have done that. And in one case, one of them is getting about 6,400 a month. So it's and in fact there are people I know that are getting above that, like 7,000 and 8,000 a month. It's a lot of money coming in. Now the only thing is and somebody in Instagram just mentioned it there. Are there regulations on HMOs in Ireland? And that is the big thing that we need to talk about, because no, there are no regulations on HMOs in Ireland at the moment. But you have to be careful because that could change. And HMO sits in this kind of gray area. And if you look at, for example, the regulations around planning permission, they did away with a thing called bed sits back in, I think it was 2011 or something like that. You were able to have a room that had a kitchen and a bathroom, and the bed sit was, somebody's saying there that's nearly as bad as a bed sit. Yes, a bed sit though was made illegal back in 2011, I think it was. And so all the bed sits were removed from rental properties all over the place. And when that happened, it was done for a reason, because the market there was a lot of difficulty inside the market. There was a lot of people, a lot of banks were kind of like complaining that there was these substandard rooms that nobody wants to rent and stuff. So the government came along and introduced this. Now today, in a housing crisis, you can't rent out these rooms because they're not allowed anymore. But suddenly you have a load of people that would be able to go and say, you know what, this is a fantastic, really, really, it's like the bottom rung of the property ladder. But you could rent a place for 500 a month. Very, very modest accommodation. Like it's not fancy in any way, shape, or form. But it is an option for somebody who is, let's say, they're recovering from, maybe alcohol abuse or being an addict or something like that. Those people that need a leg up, those people that would be perfect for them. It would kind of get their life back on track. And so there's a lot of people that are of the view that bed sits, they should not have been done away with, even though they weren't great accommodation. They did address, the lower end of the market, and they allowed people that option. So along comes, we'll say, a house near to a university, and I want to rent my house out, and I have an option of renting it to a family, and I have and then a young man comes along and says, "I'll rent your house from you." And you're like, how could you afford to rent? Oh, don't worry, I'm going to rent it to all my friends, and we'll pay. We're going to the university. So you kind of say to yourself, oh, that's grand, but I will agree to rent it to that young man, and it's his business to go and collect all the rents from his friends. And that sounds quite reasonable. That's just somebody sharing a house. The guy's renting the house and he's renting it out to his mates. House sharing. That's not illegal. That's perfectly legal. And so this is why HMOs sit in a kind of sort of gray area, because the reality is that if if you were to be questioned as to, excuse me, how are you split? Your house is split up into different rooms. Show us the planning permission for that. And you say, no, it's a house share. It's just the house is just shared. So a lot of people are kind of using that as the gray area to get around it. But I look at the regulations that are in place in the UK, and in certain areas you need a license to actually open a HMO. In other areas you need planning permission and stuff like that. And I think that there is a definite risk if you go down the road of doing HMO that somebody, in the local authority comes along and says, right, we're now going to go and regulate this. And suddenly you'll find that, crap, I'm not allowed to do this anymore. And you have to go back to the previous system of renting to a single family or something. Now, if that was to happen, you need to be very, very careful that you didn't overpay for the property. Like if you think you can get 8,000 a month rent as a HMO, but the underlying value per month is around 3 grand, that's a 5,000 a month shortfall. That's 60 grand a year that you would be down in income if you were forced to turn it into a different type of property. And you can imagine how a bank, they would be very, very careful. They'd be thinking, okay, this person is buying, he's turned it into a HMO, but in the event that HMO regulations come in at some point, this could go back to the 3 grand a month. So we need to value it based on 3 grand a month, not on the 8 grand. So the kind of people that are borrowing money for HMOs and stuff, a lot of the time they'll do it through the private market, and they'll be borrowing from like individuals who are lending money, because they're a little bit, they're taking a view on the risk, whereas the banks would sort of see things in a much, much more straightforward kind of regulated kind of a way. Let me see here from Shravan. What is good financially from a 10-year perspective, renting or buying? Will the inflated price bubble burst anytime soon? Shravan, that is a very difficult question to answer. I will tell you that I'm not as much of a betting man as I was. I was a horrendous gambler at one stage in terms of property, doing deals and stuff like that, and I would take big gambles. Now I'm a little bit more constrained, and I look at Donald Trump bringing in tariffs in the US, and I think to myself, there is definitely a global geopolitics risk there. If the American economy falters because of the stupidity of trying to impose tariffs on everybody all at the same time, I mean, it's complete lunacy, in my opinion. Like it can take years to do a trade deal with one country, and he decided to take on every country in the world at the same time. And now whenever you say, oh, when are you going to do a deal soon? Oh, we'll do a deal whenever I feel like it. I mean, it's just all the bluster of that. And so the biggest issue, I think, is that is he going to backtrack? He's so ego fueled that the likelihood is he won't backtrack, and he could actually end up triggering a global, crash of some sort, just in order to remain tough looking. And let's face it, his base, whatever he tells them, they buy it hook, line, and sinker. He managed to convince everyone in the US that China will pay these tariffs. China doesn't pay any tariffs. The people that take the product in, they're the ones who pay the tariff. And that's why he lost the head when Jeff Bezos, he had to call Jeff Bezos when there was a rumor going around that they were going to start listing the tariff cost at the bottom of every transaction. And that would have immediately stood out like, look, this is what the tariff is now costing you. So long and short of it, Shravan, is that I think right now there is definitely a risk of some sort of shakiness in the market. It's not necessarily going that the prices crash, but I think what it means is that there's possibly people that work for, we'll say, American companies, that the American company, if you're, let's say you're working for a pharmaceutical company based in Cork, and Donald Trump is complaining about pharmaceutical companies all being based in Ireland and that they need to come back to America and manufacture in America. I imagine there would be quite a few people based in that job worried about their future, thinking to themselves, are we going to be laid off? Are we going to have a situation where he imposes such a high tariff on our employer that our employer has no choice but to relocate to the US, in which case we're out of a job? Or they decide that, you know what, we have to batten down the hatches because of the tariffs. And so we're not going to have as much profit as we had before. And therefore, we're going to have to go and we're going to have to let people go. So I can imagine there's areas around, certainly in the Irish market, and there would be other countries around Europe that are also worried about this. But Ireland has a huge American base, and so I think we're more affected than others. The European pharmaceutical market is bigger than the US. It is, but there's a lot of big American pharmaceutical companies based here, and Trump is very, very determined to try to get them to relocate back to the US. Now, I don't think he's necessarily going to succeed in that, but I do think he could do a lot of damage to the businesses and the, if you think about a huge, big pharmaceutical company, those guys, they're doing billions a year in sales. And if suddenly this thing is all put on hold, or even if it slows down a little bit, that could represent hundreds of millions of a reduction. That could mean that, you know what, we have to lay off 10% of our workforce. And in certain counties of Ireland, that could be, 300 people made unemployed. That's 300 people that now can't afford their mortgage. That's 300 people now that if they're renting that property, that landlord now has a headache, or if they've bought the property, now they don't have the money to cover the mortgage. So what's going to happen? I think what that could force a lot of people to do is just slow things down and say, do you know what? Let's not buy anything. Let's not move house. Let's not like take on that, do that extension that we were going to do, because it means borrowing more money. And right now we just don't have that stability. So I think there is, I just think that there's a risk that there could be a slowdown because of that. Now, having said all that, Ireland has got an incredible supply demand imbalance. There are tens of thousands of people chasing so few properties, and that's what's driving up the prices. And so I do think there's a big risk there. Um, whilst there's the risk, there's also the likelihood that there will be people that have a stable job, that work, let's say, as a solicitor or something like that. They'll continue to be able to fund a mortgage and stuff, but there will be certain segments of the market where it's not likely to happen. Sean Murphy is asking, do you think investing through your pension is one of the most tax efficient ways to invest? No question. Thanks, Shravan. Thank you. Sean, yeah, I think that buying a property through your pension is probably the best way to do it. But at the end of the day, it really depends on your personal preferences. If you're a person, let's say you're a young guy in your 20s, the idea of buying through a mortgage may not look all that attractive, because you're thinking, hold on a second, that's like decades away. Like, I can't touch that property for decades. So no, Niall, Niall Lamont says that you can't pass it down through inheritance. It is actually, there are various structures you can use that you can actually pass the. You see, it depends. This is when we're getting into details like this, you've got to be clear. So a typical pension that most people have is where they take a certain portion of their salary every month and they send it in. And usually what the pension fund does is they'll buy stocks and shares, and your pension goes up over a duration of time. But if let's say you're a tradesman, let's say you're a plumber, you have a plumbing company, and you're out there and you're earning a good living, and you have a company, it's a limited company, and it's pulling in, let's say you're pulling in more money than you need in order to live. What you can do in that situation is you can park some of your profits into a pension, and it's not a pension in the same way as an employee would. You can actually put this money into a kind of it's called a pension trust, or there's different names for them now. But when I did my one, it was called an SART, self-administered retirement trust, and you parked your money in there, and they would set up a bank account. And if let's say I put 30 grand into my pension, the 30 grand would be sitting in a bank account, and I can decide where that money goes. Now, I can't decide to go and pay myself, or to pay a friend or something like that. It has to be done as an arm's length transaction. But let's say I found a property that I like. I could take the money that's in my pension, and I can go to a bank, and the bank will lend up to 50% against a pension. And you could actually buy the property in your pension. And the benefit of it is that, first of all, if it came into your company in its gross state, so let's say you earned 100,000, 100,000 comes in. If you wanted to buy a property in your personal name, you have to pay that 100,000 out to yourself. You're going to be taxed on that. You're going to end up with about 48% of that money. You're going to have 48 grand left. Instead, you can take that 100 grand and you can put it into a pension. All 100 goes into your pension, and you have absolutely no tax on that 100 grand. So your company pays no tax. It ends up now in your pension, the full 100. And if you go and buy a property, we'll say all rental income, tax free. If you sell that property for a profit, tax free. And it stays inside the pension pot, growing and accumulating. And if you're paying down a mortgage, you're paying the mortgage on the gross income that you're earning. There's no tax being deducted. So you can pay debt down quicker. And so if you were a person that didn't need to dip in, like if you earned enough money that you were saying, you know what, I'm just going to throw that money into the pension. I'm just going to let the pension accumulate over the next 20 years. You will probably end up with that property fully paid off, like no tax, no tax take, no debt left. And the property there is just earning an income, and you're there. Now, eventually you get to the age of, we'll say, 65 or something like that, or I think you can be even younger, but let's say, I think it might be 57 or 55 is kind of the youngest you can get out. But when you eventually decide to trigger, to get the money out, to start living off of your pension, you have a much, much bigger pot than you ever would have if you had built that pot up in your personal name. Now, it is taxable when it comes out of your pension, but by that stage, you have a much, much bigger pot than you would. Now, an employee, there's a question here or a comment from somebody, and it's, I'm an employee, but a director of of my employer's Irish entity. Can I open a SART? If you're a director, then I think you can, but like it's going to depend on your employer. You're going to have to first of all agree how much of a percentage that they're willing to kind of throw into. If you are willing to do without a certain amount of cash from your salary and instead to redirect it, then it may be possible. But you're best off going off and getting a advice on that kind of stuff, and speak to a mortgage broker or something. Somebody's saying, I'm 39 and single, too late to even bother with a mortgage. Well, at 39, it's not too late, but you're certainly later than some people. But I know, and maybe you're referring to a mortgage there, or you're referring to a pension rather than a mortgage. I know somebody that started a pension at 52, and you might say, what, 52? But the reality is that you can accelerate at that age. You can actually accelerate the amount you're allowed to put in is much higher. Um, I just joined. What's the theme of the line? We're talking about real estate investment and financing, and I've been dealing with a number of questions coming in on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, but I have a free school community, and in that school community, I posted that I was going to be doing this live, and so I asked people to go and submit questions. So I have a number of questions that I'm working from. But if you guys have questions, I might sort of drop in and take your question. Paying 425,000 for a mortgage starting soon. Would love to make my money work for me eventually. Yeah. Like the thing is one of the things that I'm going to challenge you guys on, and this is like I have a group. I coach a number of people. I would say my ideal client is somebody who owns their own business, who works probably most likely in construction or in the property sector. They own their own business and they want to know how to go about building a property portfolio. If you work as a tradesperson or on a building site or something like that, it's a hard slog. And you start when you're in your 20s and you start doing that, you got loads of energy. It's going to be, you make some good money and stuff like that. But as you get older, you don't have the same level of energy and you don't have the same amount of strength, and it starts to wear you down. And so a lot of the people that I'm working with are people that are now probably around between, say, 35 and 45. And those guys, they want to create a property portfolio. Why? Because they want the option that they can step away from the day-to-day job and have a passive income coming in. And so that's who I coach. I coach those kind of guys. Matthew Kearney, are housing estates worth to build in the west of Ireland? I'm not sure the question, Matthew, but housing estates are worth building. Apartments are not worth building outside of Dublin, or maybe Cork, we'll say. The thing about apartments are very costly to build. Houses are not so costly to build. And so you will see houses going up. You will see housing estates going up. And the great thing about a housing estate, I think I said this earlier on the call, is that you can phase the development of a housing estate. Let's say you're building 50 houses and let's say it's a site of a couple of acres and you have a road that goes in and there'll be a couple of rows of houses. You're able to build the ones at the front and sell those right away. And then you go in a bit deeper and you start finishing those. And then when they're finished, you sell those. So you're all the time keeping your debt under control. Whereas in an apartment building, you dig a big hole in the ground and you start building it up. And it's a money pit. Until the building is finished, you have got to fund the whole thing. And so apartment buildings, you can be looking at tens of millions of debt in order to build an apartment building. Whereas the same number of people could be accommodated in a housing estate, and the debt might never get more than a couple of million, because you're able to sell some of the houses as you're going, and it keeps a lid on the debt. So anyway, let me go back to some of these questions that we got. We had a few questions about investment strategy. Is buy to let still viable in Ireland with 52% tax? I would say yes, but I would say you have to be very strategic about it. For the vast majority of people, if you buy a property and that property is going to be rented out to somebody, you're not gonna make so much money on that after tax that there's much left. And I know I did this exact exercise with one of my clients, and he was working out that after taking out the mortgage and paying the tax and everything, like there was a small amount left. So the strategy that I kind of recommend is that you buy something that you can fix up and add value to. And if you can fix it up, like obviously now in this market, it's very, very hot market. It's very difficult to find value because so many people are all chasing so few properties that if you're an investor and you're trying to buy something and you're thinking, I want to have a nice return on my money, the reality is that there's maybe 10 families that are looking to buy their forever home for every one investor that's thinking that they can make a decent return. And you, as an investor, you're thinking rationally, you're thinking, okay, I need to make X return on my money. Those guys are thinking, I need a home. I need to live in this area because I love that my child goes to this school or whatever it is. And so it makes it very emotional. And when you're bidding against somebody who is emotionally sort of caught up in the decision, it's very hard for you to bid against that person, because that person is very, it's just has bought into the idea. Like they're saying, you know what, if I have to pay a bigger mortgage for a couple of years, I'll work overtime, we'll have the home, we'll pay down the debt, and over time it'll grow in value and stuff like that, you know. Frank here says, nearly finished a reno on a property I bought. How long after it's rented can I put a mortgage on it? I would say probably about 6 months, Frank, because really what you're talking about is just demonstrating your ability to finance a mortgage. And if you ask any traditional bank for a mortgage, what they want is they want you to demonstrate that for the last 6 months you've been earning enough money on a regular basis. Now you've got to make sure that you like, and this is it. If it's a rental property, then your choices get a little bit less because some banks, they don't care about the rental income of the property. They think about what is your income from your job and stuff. So you might need to shop around. I always suggest go and speak with a mortgage broker because they're having conversations with multiple lenders and stuff, so they can tell you this is the one to go for. This one over here, they're going to break your balls and just make you kind of jump through so many hoops. Derek Johnson, the government doesn't seem to know what they are doing with housing. Yes, Derek, it is a bit of a mess, and I'll tell you, there are so many things that could be done that are just not being done, and it's like you've got so many competing. Like just to start with, if you think about it from the point of view of we buy land and we build houses on it. You buy a piece of land, you apply for planning permission. It should only take 8 weeks to get planning for a house, but almost never does it get done in that time frame. And what you have is we'll say somebody in the area, might not even be an adjoining property owner or neighbor. It might simply be somebody in the next county, and they can submit an objection to your development. Why would they do that? Mischief, devilment. Sometimes it's a shakedown. Well, there was a TV documentary on RTE about a year ago, and they were talking about people submitting spurious objections, saying that we object to this development because it's going to ruin the environment and it's not sustainable enough, and there's going to be too many trees destroyed, and making it out that this was a big environmental concern. And so the developer reached out to the person and said, listen, I saw your objection. I'm open to hearing your concerns. Maybe we can fix this. And the person would meet the developer, and when they're one-to-one and he knows he's not being recorded or anything, he just say, listen, I'll remove the objection, just give us 100 grand. And like out and out bribery, just it should be illegal. There is nothing against the law about doing that, believe it or not. You can actually go out there and you can extort a developer by offering to withdraw an objection. And if the developer doesn't give you the money, then you have the right to go and appeal that decision, and you can delay this development for another 12 months or so. And a lot of the time, a developer, like, I can speak from experience. Like, we have staff that work for us. Those staff are, you want them to be moving to the next development. You want to get them on site working. And there's nothing worse than not having work for them because you're waiting for permission to go on the land and start building. And so a lot of these guys that are trying to shake down the developers, they're basically saying, these guys, they probably paid millions for the site. They want to get on site quickly. They want to get started building. We'll shake them down for a few quid. And so the first thing is the Planning Act. If that was streamlined so that you could do it quicker. The other thing is there's a thing called a judicial review. Now, in the past, what we used to do is if something didn't you didn't get if you didn't like somebody's planning application, you could appeal it to An Bord Pleanála, and An Bord Pleanála would review the thing, and sometimes they would say the local authority was right to deny this, but other times they might say, no, we disagree with the local authority and we're going to grant permission. So you had a chance to get it back on track. And that's what a lot of developers would have done. Now what you have, though, is after An Bord Pleanála decides to give you the planning, then the neighbor that didn't like it can now, if they're willing to pay for it, they can actually pay for a judicial review. And that is where it now goes to the courts. And the courts can go, and they can basically hold it up for another year or two. And so we're here in the middle of a housing crisis, and yet it can take a couple of years to get a planning permission over the line. And so I kind of think to myself, like, if I was in charge, I would be streamlining all of this. Now, this is where it gets really frustrating. They had suggested that Brendan McDonough, who is the CEO of NAMA, they had suggested that maybe he would make a really good guy that can actually go there and become this, what they called a housing czar. And that housing czar would basically overrule a lot of this stuff and would say, right, we're going to build thousands of houses over there. We're going to build that. And he just would make all this stuff streamlined. And anyway, the government ended up squabbling over his appointment. And so he withdrew his name. And I understand that it was over salary or something like that, that the government, one party didn't consult sufficiently with the other party. And it was kind of like seen as a done deal, even though they hadn't been consulted. And anyway, I'm hearing lots of different things about all that. But one of the complaints was that the salary was too high. The guy was going to be earning something like 400 grand a year. Now, 400 grand a year is a lot of money. But if you consider that there are CEOs of big PLC companies, those guys can earn $1 million, 2 million, 3 million. And we have got a national crisis here. We need people of the highest level to be able to kind of streamline some of this stuff. And so I don't think if you're a person like an senior executive and you're capable of fixing the housing crisis, well, then those skills are not just useful here in Ireland. They're also useful to PLCs, to banks, to international funds and stuff. And so those guys would say, here's a really, really capable guy. Let's offer him $1 million a year. And he'll be thinking, right, I'll take the $1 million a year. Not going to take 400 grand. And yeah, I totally. Somebody's saying here, missed opportunity by the government. 400 grand is cheap in the grand scheme. 400 grand is a drop in the ocean compared to the problem that we're facing here. Like, we're building 32,000 housing units a year. If you go back to 2007, we did 85,000 in 2007. Here we are 17 years later, and we're 50,000 a year short. And yet we have 1 million people more living in the country. And so, do the maths, like, how is that possible? So we need to streamline. We also need to, I think it's a dirty word now, but I think we need to start thinking about, the government needs to start thinking about bringing back tax breaks for certain types of development. There are certain areas that are not easy to redevelop. You think that a piece of land is a piece of land, but there's certain areas where, let's say it's a rough area, or maybe it's a challenging site because it's very narrow, or it's surrounded by adjoining properties and stuff. Sometimes that stuff can be very, very expensive to build out. And if it's really, really expensive to build out, then it can be marginal as to whether or not you'll make money on it. Densities is another thing. And I know somebody's been mentioning that densities, like Johnny Ronan, I think, has put in multiple submissions to build buildings like 30 stories high and 40 stories high and stuff. Like, I think we should be building that kind of stuff. Like, parts of Dublin are very modern, like the Docklands area stuff. Like, why aren't we like London, like Canary Wharf, 40, 50-story buildings? You could have a huge apartment buildings, and you'd be located near to public transport. You'd be right next to the Lewis, right next to the Dart, all of this stuff. So I just think that there seems to be a complete lack of joined up thinking. You got everyone, there's all these silos. You got the planners in one silo. You've got other departments that look after, would say, Irish water and electricity and stuff like that. That's another department. Then you've got the other department for the public transport. Then you got another department for the funding and the financing and the taxation. All of these things all live out on their own, and they've all got their own agendas. And this was the idea behind the housing czar, is that this guy would be kind of like all powerful, sitting in the middle, and he'd be able to like overrule some of the, like, say, no, that agenda doesn't apply anymore because we need to do this for the housing crisis. So hopefully they'll get their act together. But it's like really frustrating, just being on the sidelines and looking, and you kind of think to yourself, what on earth is, it's funny. There's if you go back in time to the 80s and stuff, there was a politician called Charles J. Haughey, and some of you will be old enough to know who I'm talking about, but a lot of you will be too young, like it's in the history books now. But he, when he, like, history will not look back on him very fondly, because he was found to be, there was corruption involved and all this kind of stuff. But brown envelope Charlie, yeah, exactly. The thing is about him, though, is he got stuff done very quickly. He overruled people. He had a great, like, when there was a big picture involved, he was very, very quick. I think it was his plan to build the International Financial Services Centre in Dublin. That was an idea that Dermot Desmond, the financier here in Ireland, Dermot Desmond came up with the idea. He did a feasibility study on the idea. He submitted it to the government at the time, and the government at the time weren't interested. And then the next government that came in, Charlie Haughey was in charge, and he said, let's go with this. And the IFSC today is enormously successful because of that. And so I do think you need somebody with that kind of big vision, who will just kind of kick doors down and get shit done, because we have a major, major issue here with our housing crisis. Anyway, let's go on to some of the other questions. New builds versus secondhand buy-to-let. Okay, if you're looking at buying buy-to-let properties are not that attractive to me, because the value is pretty much like, if you're buying a new build, the value is like the builder has just handed you the property. What's good about it is that it'll have probably a lot of insulation, a very efficient heating system, all that kind of stuff, which is beneficial. But usually you get handed over the property, and the chances of you going in there and add value to it are fairly slim. If you buy secondhand property, that's, we'll say, from the 1980s or something like that, those secondhand properties, usually they come with a larger garden, and often they have larger rooms and stuff. And so there is more scope to improve those properties. And so it would be, if I was out there looking at doing a residential, I prefer commercial myself, but if I was doing residential, I would be thinking about buying a secondhand and extending it and trying to modernize it, extend it, and then put it back on the market. And what I would probably do if I was like some of you guys that are asking these questions, move into the property, do up the property while you're living in it. Hive off a section of the house for yourself to live in, and then do up the rest of the house. And I've seen people doing that. And when you sell, like, first of all, you can do it cheaply if you know the right people, but you end up selling that property, no tax whatsoever, because it's your principal private residence. And so you can do that a couple of times. And I've seen people doing that and doing quite well. I see a question there. What would you do? What would I do? Okay. I have 4 houses, including the principal home. Would you leverage? Yeah, I probably would. He's asking, he's got a property with a value of a couple of million, and he only owes less than 10%. Like, in fact, it looks like kind of close to around 5% loan. So you've got 95% equity there. Like, there's a ton of leverage there. So yes, but what leverage it to do what? One of the issues that you have is that when you want to move on a deal, if you're bidding against other people, having a big pot of cash is very advantageous. If you go, let's say you're selling a property and 2 people come to you with an offer, and the first person says, I'd like to buy the property. I'll offer you 500,000 for your property. But I have to go and get mortgage approval. And then somebody else comes along and says, I'll give you 460, but I have the cash in the bank, and you can have the cash in 2 weeks' time if we can get your solicitor to move quick enough. So you can earn a little bit more, but you have to wait for the banks to approve and all that process. That could take 3 to 6 months. Whereas there's a guy offering you cash, and in the next 2 weeks, you can have that cash in your bank account. So it does give you an advantage having cash to buy, but you want to make sure that it's not burning a hole in your pocket. Like, if I had 95% equity there, so I had the ability to, say, take out 500,000 of a loan, you'll straight away be paying interest on a 500,000 loan. Might not be that large in the scheme of things, but if you can't find value for 9 months, we'll say you keep on looking at deals and it just doesn't make sense, you're paying interest in that loan for all that period of time. So there's kind of pros and cons to that strategy, Guys, it's 9 o'clock. I've been going now for about an hour and 15. So I've been going for an hour and 12 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up in the next 3 minutes, guys, because I've got family downstairs. So let me just ask, okay, buying, let me see, RTB horror stories. You know what, guys, I'm going to be doing this every week now. So by the way, anyone who wants to get a question asked, as opposed to it being by chance that I happen to see it, if you actually want to get a question in for me to definitely answer, go into the school community. It's if you go into school.com and type in elite property community, you'll find my community there. Join it and then submit your question, and the next week I'll be answering these questions. I see one here. Hi there. We own a company with 440K in the bank with no debt or loans. What's the best investment? It depends really. Like, first of all, where are your skills? And your skills are very important. Like, if I had 440K sitting in a bank, I'd be saying park it in your pension. If you can put the 440K into a pension, it'll be completely tax free in that pension, and then you've got 440K to play with. No tax on it, no rental income on it, no capital gains tax on it, and all that kind of stuff. However, if you're not a person that does a lot of property deals and stuff, then, like, maybe property is not the way to go. A lot of people, they don't know what they're doing, and they go and they buy something and they don't realize that, shit, now if I had known, I could have done much better. I could have done, like, for example, here's something I talked about with my coaching clients yesterday. we were talking about self-storage. I've had a couple of guys on my podcast in the last year or so, and they've American guys, and they're building portfolios that do self-storage. And self-storage, a warehouse, and you can either rent a warehouse and split it up into smaller units, and those smaller units you rent out individually. A lot of the time when you subdivide something large, you're paying a very low unit rent on something, and you split it up into lots of smaller units. People pay you much, much more for the smaller version of that unit. And so let's say you pay 50,000 a year in rent for a warehouse, but you split it up into multiple units inside. You might be able to get 250,000 in rent from individuals renting each individual unit. So little things like that can be quite attractive, but you're going to have to know what you're doing. And so I don't recommend people do that unless they have like a bit of financial education and a bit of property education. And those of you who are watching on the YouTube video, so I'm on TikTok here. I think you can find my YouTube channel easily enough there. I'm on Instagram over here. My YouTube channel is Gavin J. Gallagher. And if you go in there and look at this video live, there's actually a link through to my programs and courses and stuff. So if you guys are interested, I do have coaching and various programs for different levels. I mostly coach guys that are business owners and stuff, and I have a high level accelerator, but I also have some programs that are for kind of guys that are starting out. So I hope this was good, guys, and I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm going to go down and say goodnight to the kids, going to bed, but hope you found that one useful, and I will most definitely be back here in a week's time, so look out for that, and we'll catch you all next week. So, guys, thanks a lot. Take care.